are we?
Yeah.
Ngā me nui kia koutou mo tēnei rā. My name's Alan Johnson. I'm the convener for Child Poverty Action Group, and I'm delighted to welcome you here for this lunchtime webinar as part of our pre-election events. A warm, safe house for every child. What do we need to get there? I'd just like to open with a karakia, and then we'll proceed with the webinar. Ngā mihi o te rā, ko te whānau I hui hui nei, kia tau te rangamāri ei, kia tāpū tātou e ngā mea, I whakapono ana tātou, haumi e hui e tae ki ei. Everyone deserves a warm, safe home. For too long, politicians have taken a hands-off approach in the housing market. In our view, the results have been disastrous. Housing affordability is a joke. Rents are through the roof for low-income households, all because government has encouraged people with money to treat houses like a commodity, like a money-making scheme. But they're not schemes, they're places we live, where our kids grow up. And it's time our government and successive governments built new houses to increase the supply of affordable housing. To get there, the housing market, to get the housing market back under control, we need to crack down on property speculation through a capital gains tax. We need to safeguard families from the ravages of poor landlords through sensible protections for renters. We have people attending today, I understand, from Kāinga Ora, from public health agencies, government agencies, journalists, local government, NGOs and academics, as well as our activists and friends. And we're heartened by the overwhelming interest in the webinar, which we think reflects a desire to seriously address our housing problems. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce two speakers who will share their insights about systemic changes to the housing markets that could truly make a difference for families living in poverty. First up, we will hear from Greg Waite, a former policy analyst with the Queensland Department of Public Works, who now resides in Taitokerau and has recently carried out research for CPAG into the way the supply of affordable housing is measured, revealing a much more worrying picture for Aotearoa. In the first study of this kind in New Zealand, this series of papers provides new analysis of rental housing affordability and availability to provide a more complete picture, we believe, of today's private rental market. Following Greg, I'll introduce you to Tipura Apirana, who comes to us from the sunny or not so sunny Bay of Plenty today. But firstly, Greg, if you'd like to take it away, and then we'll have Tipura. Kia ora mai anō.
Okay, I may not be able to share the picture and still look at my notes, so I'll try and come back on as a face later and just talk and then show some slides as I go. So I'm talking today about how and why private rental affordability is so bad in New Zealand. And that's important because the largest group living in poverty rent privately. My research starts with the 2019 Welfare Expert Advisory Group's reports, which worked out what it costs to cover a basic but healthy standard of living, and updating those costs for the big price increases since then. That's the test that I apply for affordability. Who can afford a basic standard of living after paying their rent? So I'll bring up a slide now. Where are we? Oh. Yep. All right, so this is the first look at people on the minimum wage. So for example, if you're working 60 hours on the minimum wage, and we're looking on the right-hand side there, oh, sorry, I've got to minimize that, at a couple parents with dependent children. That's the example I'm talking about. So 60 hours a week for that couple with children, you can see on the bottom line in the right column, 37% can afford the rent and a basic standard of living. That leaves 63% of couple families with children who can't afford the rent. Okay, now the first big question that I'm sort of posing and trying to answer is this an income problem or a rents problem? So in a second paper, I looked at changes in the supply of affordable rental over the last 5 years. First, I've identified affordable rents, rents which households could just about afford at 3 income levels: on the medium wage, on low wages, and on benefits. So different benchmarks for different levels of income and then tracking those over time. Then I've measured whether we have more or less affordable rental homes in 2023 compared to 5 years back in 2018. I'll just share that screen again. So in this chart, and this is just one of a number of charts in the paper, you're looking at changes in the share of all rental, private rental, that's affordable for low wage workers. So, people on the minimum wage and about 20% above that. And on the top two lines, you're looking at area 1 is the most expensive suburbs. Area 4 at the bottom is the least expensive, the regional and the rural centres. The blue line for each of those areas is 2018. The red line below is 2023. And you'll see there is some increase in our most expensive suburbs at the top there. But down at the bottom, you'll notice in the cheaper suburbs over the last 5 years, some really big losses in the share of rental that's affordable. That's just one way of looking at it, but looking at how that share is changing is an easy and intuitive way to understand it. If you look at the actual numbers of affordable stock, not the total, but the affordable, first, it's a bit more complicated. First, obviously, you've got to think about demand, and over that 5 years, we had 8% population growth. So the total private rental stock grew by 6%, not quite enough. But the affordable rental stock at the benefit level, the bottom end of the market, actually shrank by 3.5%. So the poorest people are affected most by these changes. Older houses get redeveloped, new builds come in, but they tend to be targeted at the upper end of the market because the profit margins are higher. If you look at low-income working households, there was 1.4% growth in the numbers of affordable rental, but against 8% population growth, it's just not anywhere near to matching it. And even at the middle of the market, there was 1.6% growth in affordable housing, that affordable to middle incomes. So still not keeping up. The growth that we did see was, not surprisingly, in one-bedroom homes. So that information is available free to local governments to help with planning for putting new homes in the most, where they're most needed, really. Anybody can approach us and have that, and we've reached out to local government. And in a third paper, I looked at our complex social support system, why some people miss out, how payments like accommodation supplement can get less over time through neglect, really. You don't have to have big announcements for social support payments to help people less, because they often rely on, not this main benefits, but the secondary payments like accommodation supplement, which is so critical for so many people. If they're not adjusted for rent rises and income inflation, they just decline over the years. So that accommodation supplement, for example, was updated in 2018. And then the last increase before that was 2005. Okay, the next slide that I'm going to show you is a couple of international comparisons, because you can argue the to's and fro's about what's better and what's worse in New Zealand, but people came home during COVID and looked at house prices and left. It's important to know how we're stacking up in the big picture against other countries. So this chart is from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a comparison of 42 comparable countries, and there's both rent and owners with a mortgage on there, but we're looking at rent, which is the big blue lines. And it's the share of renters that are paying more than 40% of their income. So New Zealand is dead last out of 42 countries. That's New Zealand on the left. And I looked hard for this one. When you look at income, and this chart here is incomes from the OECD again, the Better Lives Index. This is net household income after taxes and transfers. Transfers means an allowance is included for services like health, which are provided below cost. So it's, as best we can get, it's true spendable income. And New Zealand over there on the right ranks in 5th position in the 2023 report, which certainly surprised me. Right next to us is Norway. And we're ahead of Australia in 8th place. Now, you know, the positions might change a bit next year. These things are always tricky to measure, but many countries are facing the same issues as New Zealand. You're seeing, you know, privatization of services, healthcare getting dearer, and so on and so forth. And so we're still stacking up reasonably well on the income side. So I guess the point that I'm making there is that our problem is more of a rents and house prices problem than an incomes problem, which is important to know when you're looking at the solutions. Now, to really understand rents, you do need to understand house prices. For 40 years, home purchase prices have risen far faster than incomes here. Our kind of free market emphasis on growth, deregulated markets, lack of capital gains tax, and in particular things like tax deductibility for investors' interest payments. All these drove up prices while actually discouraging investment in improving those homes or building new rental. These are incentives to buy more properties with more debt for capital gains. These are the policies that we voted in for 40 years. But that's not the end of it. Now we're kind of entering phase 2. The prices have topped out. You know, the capital gains are gone. A landlord can't get a decent return on $1 million home. So annual rents are increasing. If you can't get capital gains, you have to take a return from the tenant. And on top of that, home ownership rates keep falling. So unaffordable renting is replacing affordable home ownership for more and more young families and for more retirees. We've made life very much worse for many New Zealanders. And then last week, National tax policy included housing policies, bringing back investor loan interest deductibility on old homes. Like, as you may know, that was changed a couple of years back so that the rules mainly affected new homes to encourage more building of new homes. But the National wants to bring back deductibility on existing homes and also cut the bright line tax period down to 2 years. You know, I was a bit stunned about this. It's a return to the policies that encourage speculation, but it would even have a worse effect now. This is sort of like a phase 2 on steroids. Houses will be a bit more like shares. Investors can buy in good times and ride prices up, and then 2 years later, they can sell out at the top and leaving the homeowner to take the loss. Housing here is just a really big problem. We need big changes. We need a rethink. We need to build many more affordable homes so prices and rents come down slowly over time, so they're a bit more realistic. And that means less market freedom. It means better regulation. It does mean new incentives, and that has to mean some new tax. It's a balance of policies, less about growth and speculation and more about livable communities. How would we get there from here in free market New Zealand, that is really complex. I'd like to just finish by listing some big picture points I've sort of picked up by supporting Commonwealth state policy negotiations in Australia around these issues and who pays for what. First of all, scale. Many people in New Zealand are on the edge. You know, accommodation supplement just keeps you going, and yet it can decline over time. Any kind of new solutions have to be real and they have to be big to make a difference. Pilots won't cut it. We need to build many new and affordable homes. Old stock is just not suited and it's not enough. We need to balance our policies of growth and supply so that the plan for housing is sustainable. And obviously this is an issue across not just housing, but we haven't really addressed it in housing or in green responses either. Another thing I'd like to mention, there's a complex relationship between central government and the many small local governments we have. And on top of that, in today's environment of internet critics and vested interests being able to push out particular views and boost them on the internet. So we have a loss of trust in government, and yet the central players that can make things better are government, both, you know, central government that you vote for and local governments who have a difficult task. So we really do need to rebuild trust in government, and government needs to deliver new and trustable solutions. We need big changes, but they can be implemented gradually with consultation. Things can be phased in, but we need to believe in them. Okay, I'll finish there, and I'd like to hand over to Pora.
I'll just introduce Topora, Greg, for a start. We're fortunate to have Topora Apirana with us. She joins us from LifeWise and brings us a story from the front line, including a success story. Topora is a Bay of Plenty Regional Manager for LifeWise. She has a background in mental health and addiction, social work. She'll be sharing her experiences spearheading the first Indigenous-led Housing First program in the world in Rotorua. Topora will show how LifeWise partnering with iwi have been able to provide solutions through Housing First, giving warm, safe housing that fits the needs of individuals and whānau. Topora has a master's degree in Māori and Indigenous leadership with the University of Canterbury. Over to you, Topora, and ngā mihi nui ki a koe.
Tēnā tātou e te whare, ko matawhaura te maunga, ko rotiti te moana, ko kaitina te awa, ko te aroa te waka, ngā tipiki ao te iwi, no ngā hapu katoa o ngā tipiki ao ahau. Ko haumai tāwhiti te whare tūpuna, ko Pounamu nui te marae, ko te pora merito apirana tōku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, I'm Tep. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And Greg, that information was amazing. Thank you so much for all the mahi that you do. I'm here to share some stories from our people that work in LifeWise. And so hopefully I can share this presentation. And here we go. I just got to move the top slideshow. Sorry, whānau. Just trying to get from the beginning. See that? Ka pai. So, yes, I'm the regional manager of LifeWise Bay of Plenty, and I have worked for LifeWise for the last 12 years as a clinician, a registered health professional, and in the last 5 years as a manager. So on behalf of our iwi here in Te Aroha, all our people that work on the front line, I hope that you enjoy the stories that we share. So this is our beautiful township, Rotorua, and this is where we are primarily based. But in order to understand LifeWise, it's important to understand the three trusts. So LifeWise is a part of 3 trusts. We come from the Methodist Mission Northern Church, and we work in partnership with our sister trust, Airedale. We have been providing support services to the Auckland community for approximately 200 years, supporting people that experience hardship, that are often in distress, that experience mental health and addiction issues, homelessness, and other various traumas. In 2012, we were formerly known as Bainbridge House Trust. We decided to become a part of LifeWise. And so we joined the LifeWise whānau, hence becoming a part of Methodist Mission and Airedale property quite a while back, but have been serving in our local community for approximately 30 years. So what services do we deliver in Auckland? On the left, you will see our beautiful leaders, Shirley Rivers, who is the superintendent for the Methodist Mission Northern, our Chief Executive, Hahaitu Barrett for LifeWise, our Chief Executive for Airedale Property Trust, Dean Shields, and our recently appointed Chief's Operating Officer, Anne-Marie Searchfield. In Auckland, we have services from womb to tomb. Out west, we deliver whānau family services where our frontline social workers get to spend a lot of time supporting families, and they are world famous for their Mana Whānau program, where they help whānau who are at risk of having their children uplifted from oranga tamariki. So our team go in, they support our whānau for about 6 months, and then by the end of the 6 months, hopefully these families are able to sustain their own parenting techniques and can look after their children without supports. We have early childhood education services in Auckland. We have a great team of ladies who make sure that the services provided are affordable for our whānau, our south, Royal Road, and these services have been running for a long time in the community, and we are fortunate that the babies get to come into these safe, warm places where their brains and their minds are stimulated by our awesome team. The largest service for LifeWise is health and disability, where we have a team of frontline workers who go into homes and support people that have health and disability issues. One of our famous programs delivered by this service is the Loneliness Project, where our people get to go and spend time with elderly who are often don't have whānau around or need some extra supports, and that program has been thriving since it started. Housing First came to New Zealand through our former CE, Moira Lawler, back in 2015. In partnership with Paula Bennett, we were able to lead the first Housing First program for Aotearoa, New Zealand. Housing First is based on 5 immediate universal principles whereby people come first. We take down barriers, or we remove barriers. We provide immediate access to people in their whānau so that they can have safe housing. We have youth housing, whereby we have services all over Auckland where our rangatahi who are homeless are loved and supported. This team are very dynamic, and they ensure that they work in partnership with oranga tamariki, other social services, so that our rangatahi who have nowhere else to go and nowhere else to live are provided supports in a safe and loving, nurturing environment. Our Merge Cafe on Karangahape Road supports the streeties of the Auckland CBD with kai. Upstairs, we have a team of people that can help with other supports, including benefits, inland revenue information, and just other services that may help our people. And then finally, for us here in Rotorua, we have provided supported accommodation services for the last 30 years. So our history here in Rotorua is based on Edwin Bainbridge, who was a Methodist who came to Aotearoa, to the beautiful healing waters of Lake Rotomahana. The Methodist Church in England said to Edwin, look, we know you're very sick, you need to go somewhere where you can get some support. So Edwin came to Taurawa, he came to Rotorua, and he met Guide Sophia Henerangi, who became one of his closest friends. And he was the person that did the final karakia for our people when Mount Tarawera erupted. And so that is our connection to the Methodist Church through Edwin Bainbridge. That is our whakapapa here in Rotorua. And back in 1993, the Bainbridge Methodist Church decided that they wanted to provide supports to the community. They could see back in the early 90s that we had a lot of people becoming addicted to methamphetamine. We had people that were homeless, and so they wanted to help. And so these houses in the bottom picture, which belong to the church, they offered up to our community. So 4 houses, 12 beds, and a safe place for people. Over time, when we became LifeWise, those services evolved. So the top picture is now a residential service, which can support up to 15 people. On the bottom left is our Housing First service, which is the first Indigenous Housing First program in the world. Currently, we have about 12 programs here in Aotearoa, and internationally, Housing First is across all countries. In July 2022, on the 1st of July, we were asked by the government to take over an ex-COVID motel, primarily because the people staying in that motel experienced severe mental health and addiction issues. So we said yes, we relocated our people to a new facility by disestablishing the relationship with the former motel, and that service is called Supported Housing Pathways. So our services welcome people from all walks of life. We work with people who are often at risk of losing their children, who have come from a lot of family violence as well as trauma. And when people come to our service, it's because they want help. They are sick of where their life is heading. They've often been told by their families, if you don't stop using, or if you don't change the way you're behaving, then this relationship will end. The children will no longer see you. And so our supported accommodation service, nestled in the heart of Rotorua, is about helping people rebuild their lives. We work very closely with our community specialist teams, alcohol and other drug counsellors, toi ora practitioners, rongoa experts, as well as clinicians and other specialist professions. So this service is 24/7. We have about 18 to 25 staff, and it's focused on wairua, healing, and recovery. Our Housing First program was established on the 1st of May in 2019, and it was, we made sure that we had an iwi-led collaborative model. So in all other services, most contracts for Housing First are held with a provider, but when our chief executive came home from Canada after learning the model, she decided that we needed our iwi to be at the forefront. We needed our iwi, te aroa and Ngāti Whakaue, to be the korowai for this program, because this program was world famous. It had been around for about 30 years. It was created in Canada. But the reason we really liked it and wanted it here for our people was because our values were similar. The sustainability rate for tenancies was at 82%. And in the last 4 years, we've been fortunate to house 160 people in their whānau in our community. Supported Housing Pathways, as I said, was a former COVID response motel. When we went into this motel, there were 43 people living there. And after 3 days, we realized that we could not manage the pathology that was happening in that motel. It was one of the motels that was all over the media last year. And in this motel, we had just adults, but we had a lot of insidious behaviors happening, whereby our people who were vulnerable were were getting sick. Their mental health was deteriorating, addiction issues were just getting worse and worse. And unfortunately, contacts and supports were very limited for them. And so we transformed this service in partnership with MHUD into a transitional housing service that is a first for this country, where people live at this site 24/7. So the staff are rostered to support our people instead of having other forms of supports. They have people that are informed, that understand mental health and addiction issues and understand trauma. So our way is about connection and hononga. Our way is about ensuring that our people have therapeutic programs and engagements that are designed by them. We believe that when a person has full control over what their future looks like, that this is ultimate mana motu hake. We have a strong wellness focus. program that ensures that our people understand the options that are available to them. Because for so many years, their brains are so damaged that they've just lived in survival. And so we use behaviour modification to help people rebuild themselves and to give them better options for their future.
We can't hear Teresa, Te Pora.
Sorry, I can send that video. I'm not sure what happened to the sound. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Kapai.
you. We just couldn't hear the video.
Kapai. So Teresa talks about her journey, her experiences through meth addiction, nearly having her children uplifted, and recovery. And I was asked to share about some of the things that we've seen, needs and learnings. And Teresa represents so many in our community. She is one of our peer support leaders who walks alongside our people in the Housing First program to help give them hope and courage. So over the last 20 years that I've been working as a clinician and as a manager in the teams that I've been able to support, we've seen people come to our services who are broken. We've watched their children bring in their clothes and help bring in their shoes whilst they come in for treatment, and we've seen sad eyes. We've seen children who are desperate to have their parents back. And that is our motivation. That is what we say to our people at 6 o'clock every morning when they head to the gym and they don't want to head to the gym, or when they're doing maintenance and gardening and stuff like that, is we remind them about their children and how much they're needed and how much they're loved. We've seen families return to their children and their parents transformed. We've watched bridges that we thought were burnt forever rebuild between whānau. We've seen children come to our service years after, thanking us for helping their parents come back to them. We've heard stories about poverty. We've heard stories about solicitation. We've heard stories about parents who have grown up on concrete floors, exposed to some of the worst forms of trauma that you could only imagine. And we've been fortunate to be a part of that hope and to be a part of the healing for these people. And our message is clear. We believe that when parents heal, they help end the cycle of poverty and mental health, addiction issues, disorders, all of those types of things for their children. And so our mahi is focused on the parents, knowing that through their healing, they will help provide a better future and more present and loving relationships with their children. We've seen children watch their parents' wairua increase 100% when they can stand and talk about their pepeha and their maunga and identify themselves with their awa. We've watched confidence in families as they come to we have family days every quarter, and our children are invited to participate in activities, and over time we've been able to see healing and growth. We've seen children move into homes, running into the rooms saying, is this my room? Am I really staying here? And we've watched the light in their eyes, knowing that they have somewhere stable, that they're not going to school on a van from a motel anymore. But most importantly, we've watched people regain their rangatiratanga. Our service is about not only helping adults recover from their addiction and mental health issues, but it's about restoring families. And we have been fortunate over the last 200 years to have the privilege to hear people's stories, to watch people grow, and to be a part of their journey. This is the artwork from the art therapy program that our people at residential services share. And often you can see dark spaces and then you can see lots of colour and light. That's what it's like for them. And so our service works with some really high and complex, challenging behaviours, but our message is the same as our values for the Methodist Mission, Edel, Property Trust and LifeWise. We're about integrity, courage and respect. So our wero to our iwi and our community is to ensure that the people that come into our space, that work into the homelessness space, come in with a good heart, that they are prepared to hear stories that they would have never dreamt of, but most importantly, that they will do no harm, that they will love, that they will cherish our mokopuna, and that they would hopefully have the ability to create a great future for themselves. Nō reira, e ngā maunga whakahi no tua whakarere, e ngā niho te ka whiro, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, te poro. I'm coming up next, but what we'll do close to the conclusion of my speech, we'll open up the chat room and we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so, hopefully, of our webinar doing a Q&A session with that. So I'll just start with my presentation. Okay. What I'd like to do talk about today is the expanded role for social housing, and this picks up some of the themes identified in CPAG's social housing policy brief, which is available on our website. So, firstly, despite the government's efforts to build its way out of the current shortfall in social housing, it appears as though the social housing waiting list, or what they've called the public housing waiting list, has stabilised at around about 25,000 households. Almost 6,000 households are now living in transitional housing, which is an increase of nearly 1,600 over the last 2 years. Over this year and previous years, our housing operating subsidies have reached $4.1 billion a year, $2 billion of which goes in accommodation supplement grants and $1.5 billion goes in income-related rent grants. Overall, though, the cost of housing subsidies have stabilised over the last couple of years. I just have to, there we are. Oh, gosh. Sorry about this. Going in the wrong direction, but damn, sorry. Sorry about this. The Minister of Housing has claimed that since 2018, her government has increased the stock of social or public housing by 12,000 dwellings, and that numbers of households receiving income-related rent subsidies has grown by 10,000 households. These numbers are only partly correct, although the actual increases are still laudable against the background of decades of neglected sell-off by previous governments. Income-related rent-supported households have grown by 9,200 since June 2018, but kāinga order stock has grown only by 5,400 dwellings since June 2018, while its provision of income-related rent units has grown by only 2,400. The greatest increases in the stock of social housing have come from community housing organisations, or CHOs. CHOs provided the provision of CHOs into the income-related rent pool grew from 5,339 in June 2018 to 12,135 in June 2023. One of the things that's important to understand is that most of these dwellings existed as social housing outside of the income-related rent pool prior to 2018, and also around 3,600 of the houses that are now counted in that 12,000 houses in the CHO stock was actually owned by Housing New Zealand and was either sold or transferred into CHOs. And so there's a degree of sort of shuffling of numbers around both within CHO's existing stock and also between what was previously Housing New Zealand and CHOs such as the Tamaki Transformation and Accessible Properties Code on. The example of whānau housing in Otutahi Housing Trust in Christchurch illustrate the growth in this reclassification, and the table on the right-hand side illustrates this. It compares the stock of housing that each of those housing trusts had in 2020 and most recently in reported figures in 2022. It shows that over those two years, those two housing trusts added nearly 750 units to the stock of income-related rent supported houses, but actually only built 89 new houses. It also shows that if you combine those two housing trusts, they have almost 1,940 houses of the 12,000 in the CHO stock. But most of those houses existed prior to their entry into the income-related rent stock. In fact, whānau housing is as people will know, is a partnership between Selwyn Foundation and Auckland Council, and Otutahi Housing Trust is an offshoot of the Christchurch City Council's housing stock. One of the things that I think it's important to appreciate is the relationship between population growth and housing stock growth. And the graph on the right-hand side illustrates what that relationship has been over the last 10 years or so. In my view, the genesis of the current housing shortage was the high population growth that we experienced between 2014, which was not matched by the same level of house building. Between 2014 and 2019, our population grew by 8.3%, while the housing stock probably expanded by about 5.8%. This mismatch represented a shortfall of 50,000 or so dwellings. The figures on the right-hand side of the graph in 2020, 2021 and 22, of course, start to show a different picture. The COVID border closures and the building boom during 2021 and 22 reversed this sort of deficit, producing what could be called a surplus of 70,000 dwellings. That's surplus over the number of dwellings that were built or commenced construction and the very low population growth that we had during those 2 years of border closures. The question you do have to ask is, how on earth do we still have a housing shortage if we've got this sudden surplus of housing? One of the things that is important to understand is that immigration has shaped New Zealand's population over the past decade. And as our natural increase dwindles to almost nothing, our population future will almost entirely be determined by our immigration policies. Our natural increase will slip below 20,000 people for the first time in the year to June 2023. And I think that's a significant demographic trend, which was always understood to be occurring, but we're seeing this now starting to bite. Consequently, immigration, I believe, will drive housing demand. It's important, I think, that immigration policies aren't detached from housing supply conditions. Otherwise, we risk exacerbating the housing shortages, which some groups of people, such as Te Pora, has referred to, and some communities, such as the Rotorua community, will actually suffer the consequences of this poor alignment. One of the things that perhaps isn't well known is that we've had a recent return to business as usual for immigration. The government has turned up the immigration tap again, so we can expect the past pressures on the housing market to return, partly to soak up the surplus of recent new builds, but also I expect to support sagging house prices. Net migration for the year to June 23 was over 86,000 people. Roughly translated, this generates a demand for 29,000 additional dwellings. This is in the scale of what New Zealand has built, and in the scale of what we need. The addition of demand of 29,000 dwellings for 1 year of immigration, I think, is significant. One of the things that's important to think about is the governments have tended to ignore the impacts of their policies on driving demand for housing to unsustainable levels. They have instead mostly claimed that shortages are due to supply problems, especially those of urban land, and the unwillingness of councils to rezone land for housing. Both the former Housing Minister Nick Smith and the current Environment Minister David Parker have made sure that councils are directed to rezone more land for housing. And I think what we're seeing in many parts of New Zealand now is the results of that pressure in terms of quite widespread infill housing and expansive housing on the urban fringe. However, councils' reluctance to do this is driven in part by NIMBYism, that is, the sort of the wealthier, older voters voting for candidates for councils that promise not to rezone land and hence change their suburbs. But it's also driven in part by the fact that councils just don't have the money to pay for the infrastructure that's required to service those houses. I think an obvious alternative supply response is for the government itself to build houses. This was a tried and failed ambition in KiwiBuild. For the KiwiBuild program, there was a reliance on the private sector to initiate and fund most of the expected supply, and I believe this contributed to the failure. A pathway for government to build houses is in the direct provision of public rental housing, and a useful vehicle is through the initiation of projects and the procurement of development and construction services from the private sector. So what's required? I suggest that 5 things are required for us to achieve this, and they're not easy asks, but they are really go to the sort of policies that we would hope a future government and successive governments may follow. I think firstly that we need a recognition that public rental housing has more than a residual role in the housing market. It's more than just housing of last resort for the poorest New Zealanders. I think we need to have an expansive ambition to lift the proportion of the housing stock which is owned by the state or agents of the state as affordable rental housing. That is, we need to target not just the numbers of houses, but the proportion that those houses represent of the total stock. I believe we need a longer-term plan to deliver this proportion, which is based on a 10-year funding, development and procurement programs. The problem we've had and continue to have, I believe, is that government budgets and government programs are short-term and a stop-start, and it makes it very difficult for housing agencies to develop a pipeline of housing supply that will be sufficient to meet demand. I think we need transparent and long-term partnerships with iwi and hapu, NGOs, local councils and developers and builders to build, operate and sometimes own the stock. And finally, I think we need a bipartisan commitment to these programs as recognition of affordable rental housing is a critical part of our public infrastructure. Finally, how many houses should we look at providing? CPAG proposes that the proportion of state-owned social rental housing expands from the current 3.2% of the housing stock to 4% by 2030 and 5% by 2040. Such an expansion requires us building an additional 3,000 to 3,500 dwellings each year at an annual cost of about $2 to $2.5 billion. The build rate, we believe, should be tied to the immigration policy settings to ensure that people are not left homeless by rapid immigration. And other activist groups are calling for more ambitious targets in CPAG, but we support those calls too. Our view is that these numbers, these targets are not necessarily easily achievable, but credible in terms of other priorities the government has and other priorities the building and construction sectors have to build houses. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll stop the share here, and we'll just open it up for some Q&A. Are there any questions or chats that people have?
Yep, there's a thank you to all three of our speakers. There's a question for you, Greg, about whether or not the income that you've talked about is before or after tax. Greg, you're just on mute, sorry.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. It's after-tax income, and it's based on administrative data. So rather than using a survey, this is digging into confidentialised data that Statistics New Zealand makes available, but it's actual tax data in particular and benefits.
Okay, thank you. And somebody also has asked about what about the social housing built and being built?
Sorry, what was that again, Julie?
Oh, sorry, the social. There's another question which I think you've already answered in the chat, Greg. But if you could just answer it again for everybody else about the social housing that you've referred to, as I think it must be since the 1950s. Is that? It says 1050s, but I think it must be then.
Yes, I think this was a question. I'll just bring up the chat.
And you referred to Queensland in the answer in the chat.
The person was asking about problems with social housing stock, and this was a huge perennial issue in Queensland because, you know, you've got an older stock that was mainly built in the 50s, and it was all 3 and 4 bedroom houses. Well, not all, but largely. But it's aging and it's on larger properties. So this is the issue of redeveloping social housing into, you know, fit for modern purposes. So building more smaller units without going too far, you know, keeping a decent community and, you know, finding the funding for that. But of course, this can be done really well. The state has a lot of larger properties that are overdue for redevelopment and more freedom to redevelop to improve that community. It's a question of funding, though, which comes back to the point I made earlier that, you know, you need to rebuild trust in government and you need to give them the funding to do obvious solutions like this rather than sell it off just because it's not that suitable at the moment.
Thanks, Greg. There's another question here, and it may not be a specific housing answer, so it might not be for the experts in the room today, but the question is, do you factor in non-economic benefits of government rental housing? I guess that means health and that kind of thing.
Yeah, if that was directed at my research, no, I'm really only focusing on private rental just because it's such a big problem and relatively unexplored. But certainly there's great research out there that looks at the, you know, the beyond the affordability benefits of social housing. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. And I just point people to the policy briefs on our website. We do have briefs covering a wide range of issues, including health, and obviously health and good housing are inextricably linked. So just moving to Te Pora now, there's a question for you, Te Pora, and it's that have Lifewise been able to see whānau into permanent own your own homes?
We have. It's taken a long time, but yes, we have throughout multiple services. So even though a lot of our services are government funded, over time our people are able to secure better employment with higher incomes and eventually go into their own permanent housing ownership. And we're fortunate here in Rotorua to have multiple papakainga developments, a lot of iwi developments that are happening for first home buyers. So yeah, there's a lot happening here in Rotorua because our need is huge too.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Kia ora. One more question for you, Te Pora. Does Te Arawa provide housing and mental health support for the iwi?
Yes. And I know I answered it in the chat, but our iwi are able to support through our kaupapa Māori providers. Our whānau order provider here in Te Arawa offers multiple services and supports But yes, we also have a large number of kaupapa Māori providers that provide suicide prevention support and linkages into the Papakainga development supports.
Kia ora, and kia ora for your frontline mahi. Alan, I just want to ask you a question now from the chat. Do you have an analysis of types of housing, i.e. affordable versus social versus market value, built in relation to net immigration by year? Is that something you've looked at?
The data is available. To precisely define each of those categories of housing and to allocate it against a year of immigration is a little bit difficult, though. The reason for that is partly there's always a lag between immigration and house builds in any case. So it's only an approximate fit, but the sort of, and that sort of analysis is available and can be provided.
Awesome, thank you. I can see that there's a question here from Audrey about whether CPAG has a view on what to do about ghost houses. That's it was estimated a few years ago to be 40,000 in Auckland alone. I'm not sure if that figure's still accurate, but Alan, do you have a view on that?
Our view is that a good tax policy would start to address the practice that some property owners have of just keeping their houses empty for the reason that they're making more money by in capital gains than they would be through renting them out. If we were to tax housing, particularly second and third houses, and add something like their economic value instead of allowing them to stay idle, then people would actually be faced with a choice of having to pay tax on something that's not earning money straight away, or actually use that asset in the best socially and economically efficient way.
Okay, kia ora. Alan, here's another question for you. Kāinga Ora is building low quality housing in most cases. They don't meet acceptable standards around amenity, area, accessibility and aspect. Their design and construction characteristics will contribute to residualisation, and the houses won't have an economic life much beyond 20 to 30 years. Why do you think the state can do any better than it is doing now?
I would dispute that claim that Kāinga Ora is building substandard houses. There is a lot of housing being built in my neighbourhoods, much of it by Kāinga Ora, and I will compare Kāinga Ora's construction design with that done by the private sector and believe that Kāinga Ora is easily more superior. I think that the person asking the question is right about whether or not the housing that's being built will have a long-term future given the way people live, and there is something of a trade-off being made in Kāinga Ora housing between the space that people, the private and personal space that people have, and the way that they need to achieve densities. And so that's always a trade-off. But I don't believe that Kāinga Ora's houses are substandard. I think they're built to the best standards available. I think they're well designed, and I think often they're well appointed with additional features that aren't seen in private development. So I believe that both the example of Kāinga Ora and the example of public agencies having perhaps a mission to not just seek the lowest cost option is something that will ensure that quality is lifted and maintained.
Thanks. I tend to agree with you. I've seen some pretty ugly privately built houses in my neighbourhood too. Mike Potter from Disability Connect is asking a really important question. Through improved healthcare, our aged population is living longer, and our disabled population, particularly those born in the last 30 years, is growing too. What role do you see universal design playing in new builds and retrofits to meet both current and future population needs?
Mike and I have had this conversation before. At the moment, I understand Kāinga Ora is designing around about 25% of their stock as being available for people with accessibility challenges. Many claim that it should be the whole stock, and I tend to agree that it should be more than 25%, but whether or not it should be 100% really, I think, comes down to a question of what the relative costs are. Certainly, Mike is right to say that as our population ages and as people live longer, the reality is that we'll need housing that's far more accessible, friendly, and we just don't have that housing, and the cost of retrofitting it is massively more than the cost of doing it right in the first place. I would sort of urge Kāinga Ora to at least lift their accessible universal design proportions at least to 50% of new housing, however.
Okay, and I think we'll just have one more. I'm really sorry we're not going to be able to get all of the questions, but we are running out of time. But we will try and answer them on the emails. Ellen, maybe, or Greg, or Te Pora, I'm not sure. This is from the Todd Foundation. What do you think about private investment in build-to-rent properties? Is that part of the solution? Ellen, do you want to?
There is already private. There's quite a lot of private investment in build-to-rent properties, and I think Greg's experience of Australia, where this has been going for some years, is probably more relevant than anything I can offer. Greg?
No, in my time, the state government wasn't very involved in this, but I mean, clearly in the longer future, we are looking at institutional investment, but it needs to be an institutional investment of the right kind too, and that's harder to achieve. You know, it's easy to throw out a subsidy, but so you're talking about large-scale investment and getting new stock and getting affordable stock. So all the right things are possible there, but you know, equally there was a recent policy which subsidised high-end build-to-rent, and this happened earlier in England. You know, government caved to pressure and subsidised stuff that really is about upper-end rentals, and you know, that's not terribly helpful at all, because the market will always cater to that group, but it doesn't cater to the people on lower incomes.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Look, I think that is we actually are out of time, but we are pasting the questions in, and we'll actually try and answer them. But for now, I just want to say a big thank you to all three of our speakers. Ellen, I'm going to hand over to you to close up. Thanks.
I'd like to thank all of you for making time to attend this kōrero, and especially our speakers, Greg and Te Pora. Their talks for me have been thought-provoking and illuminating, and we're really grateful for the time they've shared with us and their expertise and their knowledge. We'll be sending out a toolbox in the coming days for people wanting to know more about how they can be kept in this conversation, and we can always email us at CPAG, and we'll do our best to help you. I'd just like to close with a karakia. Kia whakaeria te tapu, kia wā te tiara, kia tūru ki whakataha ai, kia tūru ki whakataha ai, haumie hui tae kie. Ka ki te ano.